On episode 2, we took you into the dark fantasy world of Brian Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter. Pages and pages of police reports document a childhood riddled with family abuse and a juvenile record that detailed violent tendencies even before the Canal Murders. That all caught up with him in 2015. Host Brianna Whitney picks up the story here in California.
Who could this suspect possibly be?
From underneath the patio, they pulled out a car we never even knew he had.
I've been involved in cases that we solved in 2 hours, and I've been involved in cases that we've solved in 2 years.
I think hoarding was enough. Did they really need to go zombie hunter? You know, you just go, I mean, you're making the guy out to be a complete loon. He's a complete loon.
Oh my God, they got him!
This is True Crime Arizona, the Zombie Hunter.
All of Phoenix. I mean, it's getting really bad.
Meantime, Phoenix police had a warning for people as well. They were telling bicyclists to be extra careful along the canal. 1993. Phoenicians sat in fear. Shannon Almock and Cynthia Cano's murders were unsolved, and still are. Cynthia was stabbed to death. Shannon was strangled, but nothing at those two scenes seemed to match any evidence from the others. Brandy Myers was still missing, and police were no closer to solving the Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis murders, but they knew the same person's DNA was at both crime scenes. Likely the DNA of their killer. Who it belonged to was a mystery.
I was a sergeant in the media relations unit in the Phoenix Police Department, and during that time there were two of us. There was myself as the media relations sergeant, and there was a detective that I worked with, Leo Spiliopoulos. And Leo had the first case, and he happened to be on call that week. 10 months later or so, I was on call. I was called out to a scene, and the detectives quickly surmised that the two could be related.
Kevin Robinson was on the Melanie Bernis murder scene in 1993. He worked for the Phoenix Police Department for over 30 years and became an assistant police chief over the investigations division, which included sexual assault and homicide. Finding Melanie Bernis and Angela Brasso's killer was the key focus for the department at the time.
We've talked to literally hundreds of people. It's virtually impossible that someone doesn't know something.
But I remember conversations about, who could this suspect possibly be? Could they be a truck driver that drives around, that moves around? Maybe what type of job would bring you back here 10 months later? So there were a plethora of things that the detectives had to sit down and try to figure out, because there were about, if I remember correctly, about 10 months in between the two crimes. Could it be somebody who travels this canal with any regularity? So I remember back then, the detectives every day at certain times, a couple of hours before and a couple of hours afterwards, were out on the canal talking to people. Do you travel this route with any regularity? Do you exercise this way every day? So they wanted to try to find out the best they could. Could someone have seen something but not knew they saw it?
But every lead or theory led to nothing. For months, that turned to years, that turned to decades. Phoenicians moved on, with questions of what happened to Melanie and Angela pushed to the back of their minds. The millennium came, the 90s turned to the 2000s. Life began changing at a rapid pace, and the new wave of advanced technology was upon everyone. That led to the year 2014, and a California woman who would unexpectedly break this case wide open.
So we didn't expect this investigation to take us to California, but DNA played such a huge role in this case, and it really would not have been solved without a forensic genealogist who agreed to do an interview with us. So that's where we're headed.
A road trip to the California coast, Huntington Beach. The air was crisp and cool, We got to feel the sand in our toes while shooting video, and there was an ease and happiness to watching the tide roll in as families played along the coastline. We certainly weren't in Arizona anymore. Even with relaxing ocean views, we were feeling something different, excitement and anticipation to meet Colleen Fitzpatrick.
I am a forensic genetic genealogist. I've worked actually forensic genealogy cases in 53 countries.
She's lived in Fountain Valley, near Huntington, for 30 years, and she has one of the most interesting and impressive backgrounds I've ever come across as a journalist.
So what is genealogy?
Well, genealogy is the study of family history, family names, family pedigrees. Genetic genealogy is when DNA is introduced as a tool to doing that.
Genetic genealogy is something that's kind of newer to people, to criminal cases. What's your background that led you to doing this for a career?
Actually, I have a doctorate in nuclear physics from Duke. I contracted with NASA and the Department of Defense on laser technology for many years. But in the meantime, about 2000, I became aware that DNA was available to genealogists.
By now, in 2021, you've probably heard quite a bit about genealogy. So many people have used websites and databases like Ancestry.com and 23andMe to find out more about their backgrounds and family history. It's become popular for adoptees to locate their birth parents or biological siblings. But about a decade ago is when Colleen thought it could be used for something else.
In about, I'd say 2010, I became aware that it could be applied to cold cases. So why not use it for cold cases? Because a John Doe or a Jane Doe or an unidentified assailant, that's the same as an adoptee. You don't know who they are, you don't know their parents, but you can use DNA to find out.
One of Colleen's first experiences using forensic genealogy to try and solve a cold case was up in Seattle. And to be frank, it didn't go well at all.
There's a lot of people that find this kind of DNA matching and ancestry fascinating, but there's also another part of the population that says, I don't want my DNA out there and I don't want the government or an organization to have it. Have you run into that kind of mentality with your work?
At first, of course, I did. Sarah Yarborough case in 2010-11, I was flamed, I was ostracized, I was insulted, and there was so much misinformation and so much emotion behind using public data to solve crimes.
People were mad?
Yeah, people were upset, angry, but really it was out of ignorance, out of a reaction rather than thought.
It took years, but perception started to shift. Less skepticism and more hope.
I would say it wasn't until maybe 2014, 15, 16 that it gained momentum, because by then you had 23andMe, you had Ancestry, you had family tree DNA, and I believe MyHeritage. So you started having a variety of companies, a variety of options. It was gaining momentum, gaining popularity.
It was around this time Colleen's life would change, though she didn't know it yet. She had no idea this would be the beginning of a groundbreaking discovery in forensics.
So how did you get involved with Phoenix Police in the first place? Because the Canal Murders in 2015 had been cold for over a decade.
The way I got involved with the Phoenix Police Department was I happened to be in Phoenix for a conference called the International Symposium on Human Identification, ISHI. And some of the police were there, some members of the police department were there. I called them in advance to say, I'll be in town, there's a big DNA conference there. Can I make an appointment to come over and talk to you about some of the ways I'm using DNA in genetic genealogy? And they said, sure.
So they talked. Colleen told them about genealogy, how she could use the Y chromosome DNA to find a male line of relatives.
One of the detectives said, well, we have a case we may be sending to you. And I said, okay, fine, I'll be waiting to hear from you. And then several weeks later, they sent me the Y DNA profile. from the crime scene for the Phoenix Canal Murders.
Was there anything that stuck out to you as being kind of odd or unique that would help in what you do?
You know, the profile itself was not odd. It's basically a string of numbers. Now, with more experience, 10 years later, you know, in doing this, I can look at some of those numbers and say, looks like a Caucasian, looks like Native American. You know, the DNA itself, I know it's used to identify a person directly, but it also has sort of a flavor behind it. And, you know, an experienced person can look at it and say, yeah, probably Caucasian, you know, probably African American. But then, of course, you have to really prove that. There are tools now that, you know, you can use.
Colleen and her team, now part of her company, Identifinders International, took the numbers from the profile and got to work. It's a tedious process.
The average solve time is 60 days. I've been involved in cases that we solved in 2 hours, and I've been involved in cases that we've solved in 2 years. So we developed software to mine the data and find matches with the crime scene against that data that was online. And so we entered the numbers from the forensic profile into our software. We did the search, and that's where I came up with 6 matches to the name Miller.
How does that work? When you say that they were an exact match, how can DNA from one person be an exact match to 6 different profiles? How does that work?
In this case, you can do that because it's only the Y DNA. In other words, everybody in that family along the direct Miller line will have that same Y DNA. Y DNA is passed intact from father to son through the generations. They are his family members, but he doesn't know it. I mean, it's not close. I've had cases where I've done this, and I've gotten the name of whoever it was, and the connection was back in the 1600s.
Before Colleen's discovery, Phoenix police had been looking at around 2,000 potential suspects. Once they got the last name Miller, they had a hunch of who it may be, but genealogy is only a tip, not concrete evidence. They were going to need the man's DNA. So they set up an undercover operation to get his DNA from a local restaurant after he ate, and they sent it to the crime lab to be compared to the DNA left at the Canal Murders scenes. Since it's a process that takes time, Colleen had kind of forgotten about it all, busy with other work in the meantime, until January of 2015.
I was told by one of the detectives that they were in like a staff meeting Friday afternoon or something. It was kind of boring, but it's that stuff you have to go through, right? And they got a call from the DNA lab saying, can we come over and talk to you? And they said, okay, they were very happy. Somebody would come, you know, and break up this meeting. So one guy said, hey, I bet you they're coming to tell us they solved the Phoenix Canal Murders. And the other guy said, no, they're probably just asking for overtime, you know, again, whatever. Well, they came in and they said, you solved it, that's him. His DNA matches the crime scene DNA. I happened to be across the street at a restaurant having dinner with a friend, and I saw Troy Hillman ring in. I said, excuse me, I gotta answer this. And he says, we're right, that's right. Brian Patrick Miller, you know, we've arrested him and you were right. And at that moment, I went, oh my God, they got him.
He never seemed like the type of person to do that. I mean, he was always nice to me, you know. He always seemed to have a loving relationship with his daughter. You know, I just can't fathom it.
The Phoenix community was in shock. Brian Patrick Miller, the man so many knew as the zombie hunter, linked to 2 horrific murders from more than 20 years ago.
It sounds odd when someone like us in this situation express love for this person, because due process and everything our heart goes out to the families. It's the worst nightmare in everybody's list. But as far as this guy goes, you know, he was so great to us that, you know, you don't build a relationship like that and then just that feelings that just don't go away overnight.
Police began a search of his home, and history repeated itself. It was disgusting. Just like his apartment after juvenile detention, only now he had become a hoarder too. There were things everywhere, Piles and piles of belongings and random items inside and outside the house. Neighbors and looky-loos watched detectives sift through it all.
From underneath the patio, they pulled out a car we never even knew he had.
I think hoarding was enough. Did they really need to go zombie hunter? You know, you just go, I mean, you're making the guy out to be a complete loon. He's a complete loon.
This was the man who'd been portraying this zombie hunter character in the public eye. A good guy, posing for pictures and videos with other law enforcement officers at community events. Kevin Robinson says that makes understanding Miller's actual personality much more difficult.
Just a character that they happen to take on. Sometimes it's not too different from who they actually are. Some people will hide in plain sight, and maybe that's what he was doing. But people like that are wannabes, that they're not able to do certain things, so obviously they adopt a different persona and they move forward from there. It most definitely complicates things from the standpoint of trying to understand this individual more completely. Because that's what you want to do. You want to be able to understand them completely.
But Robinson says there are some things understood to be true. Typically, when heinous homicides are committed, like Angela and Melanie's murders, there's a certain headspace the killer is in, one you and I couldn't possibly understand.
The person has a great deal of anger when they're committing the crime itself. The issue is going to be, or the question I would think, is why are they that angry? What's causing them? What's triggering that episode? What's triggering that level of violence on that particular victim is the thing that they're trying to get to and to understand. Why somebody would decapitate somebody, there's a level of sickness or depravity rather, that is, it's hard to explain.
It wouldn't be until weeks and months later that investigators would learn about the deep, dark past and trauma Miller harbored inside. As everything was unfolding in Arizona, Colleen was still back in California and told to stay silent.
First of all, the Phoenix Police Department asked me to stay under the radar.
But this was the first cold case successfully cracked by forensic genealogy ever. And as the dust settled, Colleen did eventually start talking about it. It seemed to give the genealogy world more credibility when it came to using the practice for forensics. Not only did the Phoenix Police Department give Colleen more cases to work on, but she started getting calls from agencies all over the world.
How has genetic genealogy changed or improved since you made that discovery back then?
It's exploded. Now, genetic genealogy and forensic genetic genealogy has exploded.
Have you been able to help crack any other criminal cold cases since Brian Patrick Miller?
Oh, tons.
How many, number-wise, if you kind of could guess?
Gosh, you see, it's hard to say. A couple of dozen or more.
How did that make you feel as a genealogist, knowing that not only what you do works, but that you just helped families who were looking for answers for so long about what happened to Angela and Melanie?
I worked in high tech for a long time. Nuclear physics, lasers, the whole thing. But to me, it was always separated from what I saw the world around me. I had my friends, my family, but what I did was abstract in a way. It did help people. It eventually went into development that helped people, but it wasn't directly related. And so the forensics to me is, I feel sometimes I've arrived because I can take all of that education, all of that background, all of that experience, and really help people directly.
Do you plan on doing this for a long time?
Oh, I'd probably do this for the rest of my life. I'm going to work until the day I die. I'm going to do this to the day I die.
Even 6 years later, talking about the Canal Murders arrest and her research leading to it still excites Colleen. She made history in the world of forensic genealogy.
It's amazing to me that after so many years, exactly one word cracked that case, and the word was Miller.
So often, a case has its peaks and valleys. Small victories and breakthrough developments, those are some of the best moments for those involved. Sometimes, it's the only way to keep hope. But the downs can be some of the biggest blows to families. Frustration, sadness, anger, those are feelings that sometimes never go away. And in this case, there's another little girl gone.
I remember when it occurred. I was clearly on the department. I was working. You know, you remember certain cases, especially missing children, that, you know, it took a great deal of attention, you know, from the Phoenix Police Department. I know we did everything we possibly could to try to find her.
Her name is 13-year-old Brandy Myers, yet her name isn't part of this trial, but to many, it should be.
At the wheels of justice, they grind slowly.
Next time on True Crime Arizona, The Zombie Hunter.
I watched her go around the corner and there were tree groves there. So she passed in between them and I saw her in that moment, and then that was the last time I saw her. And it finally makes sense. It finally tells me like why she didn't come home, why we never found her body. Exactly like, look at this man, everything adds up.
True Crime Arizona, The Zombie Hunter is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. Sergio Hernandez is the producer.
This episode was edited by Shane Egan. It's a production of Arizona's Family, CBS 5, 3TV, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.